At 10 minutes to 4 on Sunday afternoon, March 24th, 1878, a three-masted warship under full sail rounds Dunno's Point on the southern tip of the Isle of Wight. She is HMS Eurydice, a 26-gun Royal Navy frigate, 921 tons of oak and iron, 140 feet of sleek wooden hull, cutting through the English Channel at 8.5 knots. Her studding sails billow from fore and mainmast. Skyscrapers and bonnets stretch her canvas to maximum reach. She is, by every account, a magnificent sight, one of the most beautiful ships still sailing under the white ensign. Her gun ports stand open along the main deck, letting the mild spring air circulate below. It is a Sunday. The crew have finished their captain's inspection. The weather is fine. The sea is calm. England is close enough to smell. In less than 10 minutes, every one of these facts will become a death sentence. Of the men aboard HMS Eurydice that afternoon, and the number is somewhere between 319 and 368, because records from Bermuda had not yet arrived, only 2 will survive. The rest will drown, freeze, or be dragged to the bottom of Sandown Bay. In one of the worst peacetime naval disasters in British history. Families watching from the cliffs of Ventnor and Shanklin will see the whole thing happen. Among them, a 3-year-old boy named Winston Churchill, who will remember it for the rest of his life. But to understand how a warship sinks within sight of home, you have to understand what brought her there. HMS Eurydice was launched on May 16, 1843, at Portsmouth Dockyard. Designed by Admiral George Elliot, she was built for speed, a shallow draft hull, broad sail plan. 26 32-pounder guns, 18 on the upper gun deck, 6 on the quarterdeck, 2 on the forecastle. She was considered one of the finest frigates in the Royal Navy, fast enough to chase down privateers, agile enough to operate in shallow Caribbean waters. For her first 2 decades, she earned that reputation. Service on the North American and West Indies station, patrol duty off the Cape of Good Hope, a deployment to the White Sea during the Crimean War where she helped blockade Russian ports and assisted in capturing enemy vessels. But by the 1860s, the age of sail was dying. The French ironclad Gloire launched in 1859. HMS Warrior, Britain's revolutionary iron-hulled warship, entered service 2 years later. Wooden frigates like Eurydice were suddenly obsolete. In 1861, she was taken out of active service and moored in Portsmouth Harbour as a stationary training ship. For 16 years, she sat there, a relic of another era, teaching young recruits the basics of naval routine while never leaving the dock. Then, in 1875, the Admiralty had an idea. Traditional seamanship was being lost. Young sailors were learning their craft. On ironclads and steamers, never touching a halyard or reefing a sail in open water. The lords of the Admiralty wanted to change that. They needed a seagoing training ship, a real sailing vessel that could take raw recruits out into the Atlantic and teach them how the Royal Navy had once been built. They chose Eurydice. The refit began in April 1876 at John White's yard in Cowes, on the Isle of Wight. Workers gutted the interior. New berthing was installed for 280 trainees. The armament was reduced to 6 64-pounder guns. Water tanks were expanded to carry between 86 and 117 tons, not just for drinking, but as essential ballast. The lower tier of tanks was designed never to be emptied. Without them, the ship would ride too high, too light, too vulnerable to sudden shifts in wind. In May 1877, the refitted Eurydice was tested in Portsmouth Harbour, artificially rolled to measure her stability. The results were satisfactory, a metacentric height of 4 feet 6 inches. She was declared seaworthy. Captain Marcus Augustus Stanley Hare took command on February 7, 1877. Hare had entered the Royal Navy in 1855. Lieutenant by 1857. Commander by 1867. Captain by 1873. 4 service medals. A devout Christian. A man described by his peers as a rare good seaman. Precisely the kind of officer you would trust with a ship full of teenagers learning to sail. On November 13, 1877, Eurydice sailed from Portsmouth for the West Indies, accompanied by the training brig Martin. At Madeira, they were joined by the Liberty from Plymouth. The 3 ships spent the winter cruising the Caribbean, Bermuda, Barbados, St. Lucia. The trainees learned to hand and reef sail in tropical waters. They learned to read the wind, to work the rigging, to keep a wooden ship alive on the open sea. It was exactly the kind of education the Admiralty wanted. On March 6, 1878, Eurydice departed the Royal Naval Dockyard in Bermuda for the return voyage to Portsmouth. Before sailing, she had taken on additional passengers, time-expired soldiers and sailors heading home, a few invalids, some prisoners, and an amount of heavy wire rigging as freight. Captain Louis Ferrier of the Royal Engineers was aboard, returning from command of the 32nd Company at Bermuda. The ship was full, the passage was fast, 16 days across the Atlantic, handling perfectly. On the morning of Sunday, March 24th, Eurydice raised the Lizard, the southernmost point of Cornwall, England. The crew's spirits lifted as they sailed up the channel in fine weather. Light wind, smooth sea, sunshine breaking through scattered clouds. Captain Hare conducted his Sunday inspection. The men changed from their white tropical uniforms into blue regulation dress for home waters. Below decks, they packed their kits. Some of the young trainees had been away from England for 4 months. They were hours from home. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Eurydice was off the Isle of Wight. The Bonchurch Coast Guard station logged her position, moving fast under plain sail, studding sails on fore and main, bonnets and skyscrapers. She was a picture, the kind of ship that made people stop on the cliff tops and stare. On the water nearby, only 2 other vessels were present. A fishing boat under a Mr. Colnut, returning to Shanklin, and the schooner Emma under Captain Langworthy Jenkins, bound from Newcastle to Poole with a cargo of coal. Both were small craft. Neither would have drawn a second glance on any other day. At 3:40, Eurydice entered Sandown Bay. Portsmouth was 8 miles away. She was rounding Dunnos Head, a cape where chalk downs rise, 800 to 900 feet above the sea when something changed. Not gradually, not with warning, the air simply turned. A squall had been tracking southeast from the north of England since morning. Snow had fallen at Leicester at 1:45 that afternoon, followed by violent gusting wind that lasted barely an hour before passing. The system moved fast. By the time it reached the Isle of Wight, it had compressed into something ferocious, a wall of snow and ice driven by winds of near hurricane force. The geography of Dunnos made it worse. The high cliffs screened the approaching storm from the northwest, hiding it completely from anyone at sea level. Eurydice's crew could not see it coming. The squall came roaring down the steep slopes of Lukum Chine like an avalanche of frozen air, striking the frigate just before the beam. It hit at approximately 3:50. Witnesses on shore described a blackening of the sky so sudden it seemed like nightfall, snow so thick you could not see your hand in front of your face, wind circulating at enormous speed, one moment calm, the next shrieking across the bay. Mr. Colnut, in his fishing boat, had just enough time to duck under Culver Cliff for shelter. Captain Jenkins, aboard the Emma, immediately reefed his sails, but Eurydice, still under full canvas, still carrying every sail she had, took the blast broadside. Captain Hare reacted. He ordered the lower stun sails taken in. He ordered the royals lowered. He called for the topsail halyards to be let go and the main sheet released. These were the correct orders, given in the correct sequence by a man who knew exactly what to do. It did not matter. The wind was too strong, the snow too blinding. The young trainees, many of them teenagers, some on their first real voyage, could not execute the orders fast enough. The royals came down but were never furled. The sails caught the full force of the gale. Eurydice heeled hard to starboard, and the gun ports were open. The sea rushed in through every opening along the starboard side. Water flooded the main deck, pouring down the hatchways into the lower compartments. Men below were caught instantly, trapped in a hull that was tilting, filling, going dark. Those on deck scrambled for the high side as the ship rolled onto her beam ends. The keel rose out of the water, sails dragged across the surface of the bay. She went down bow first. Men who had been clinging to the rigging, to the hull, to anything solid, were pulled under in the vortex. The suction was immense. Captain Hare was seen standing near the stern as the ship began her final plunge. He clasped his hands together in prayer. He did not try to swim. The entire sequence, from the first gust to the moment Eurydice disappeared beneath the waves, took no more than 10 minutes. She settled on the seabed in 11 fathoms of water, roughly 66 feet down, lying on her starboard bilge about 2 3/4 miles offshore. Her lower yards remained above the waterline. Her foretop gallant mast and main royal mast had both snapped away. The mizzen royal was the only sail furled. The snow continued to fall. Visibility dropped to nothing. The water temperature was barely above freezing. And in that water, scattered across Sandown Bay, hundreds of men were dying. Many of the crew were strong swimmers. It did not save them. The cold killed faster than exhaustion. Men who had survived the sinking, who had fought their way to the surface, who had found wreckage to cling to, they simply froze. Their muscles locked. Their fingers slipped. They went under without a sound. Others cried out for help in the blinding snow, their voices carrying across the water to no one who could reach them. Benjamin Cuddiford was an able seaman from Plymouth, a first-rate swimmer. He had been one of the last men aboard as Eurydice went down. He surfaced in the freezing water and began swimming. Around him, his shipmates were drowning. He tried to help 2 or 3. Then 4 men grabbed onto him at once, dragging him under. He kicked them off. He had no choice. Cuddiford swam for more than an hour. Sidney Fletcher was 19 years old, an ordinary seaman from Bristol, not even part of Eurydice's regular crew. He was a seaman from HMS Rover taking passage home. He was below decks when the squall hit. He heard the noise, rushed up the hatchway, and heard the cry that no sailor ever wants to hear. All hands for themselves. He grabbed a life buoy and threw himself overboard. At approximately 4:45, nearly an hour after the sinking, the snow began to clear. Captain Jenkins aboard the schooner, Emma saw wreckage on the surface. He sent a man into the rigging. The lookout reported a man floating in the water, wearing a cork jacket. Jenkins made sail, tacked once to close the distance, and lowered boats. The Emma's crew pulled 5 men from the sea. All 5 were unconscious, barely alive, their bodies shutting down from hypothermia. Jenkins brought them into the schooner's cabin, stripped off their soaked clothing, and tried to restore circulation. He made for Ventnor with his colors at half-mast and hoisted a distress signal. A boat came off from shore. Commander Roche of the Coast Guard arrived. 2 doctors were summoned, but 3 of the 5 rescued men were already dead or dying. First Lieutenant Francis Hope Tabor, a thoroughly efficient sailor who had once commanded HMS Cruiser in the Mediterranean, died from exhaustion before reaching shore. Captain Louis Ferrier of the Royal Engineers lay calm and peaceful in death. An ordinary seaman named Bennett had been dead before they pulled him from the water. Cuddiford and Fletcher were taken to the cottage hospital at Bonchurch near Ventnor. They recovered. They were the only ones. News of the disaster reached Admiral Fanshawe at Portsmouth by telegram around 7 that evening. Government tugs HMS Grinder and HMS Camel were dispatched immediately, arriving at the wreck site by midnight. At dawn on March 25th, divers from Portsmouth Dockyard, equipped by the firm of Seabay and Gorman, went down to the wreck. They attached buoys and chains to the hull. Strong currents and poor visibility made the work agonizing. In the days that followed, bodies began washing ashore along the eastern coast of the Isle of Wight, at Sandown, at Shanklin, at Bembridge, St. Helens, Chile, Whitwell. Many were unidentifiable. They were buried where they were found, some in Shanklin Cemetery, some in Christchurch Churchyard at Sandown. 6 graves in Shanklin bore no names at all. On March 27th, a coroner's inquest convened at Ventnor. The 13-man jury heard testimony from Cuddiford and Fletcher. They heard how the sails had been set, how the orders had been given, how the gun ports had been open, as was normal on a Sunday for ventilation. The jury deliberated for half an hour and returned a unanimous verdict. Accidental drowning, caused by a sudden squall. No blame could attach to the captain, officers, or crew of the ship. A formal naval court of inquiry followed aboard HMS Duke of Wellington at Portsmouth, presided over by Admiral Fanshawe. Approximately 30 witnesses were heard. The conclusion was the same. Stress of weather. No fault. But there were questions that lingered. Eurydice had always been known as a lively vessel, quick to roll, quick to heel. Her extreme design, optimized for speed, came at the cost of stability. Her gun ports, configured to remain open for ventilation during training operations, became a fatal weakness the moment the ship heeled beyond a critical angle. And there was the matter of ballast. Cuddiford testified that the ship carried her proper ballast. But the water tanks, those tanks that formed an essential part of her stability, had been partially consumed during the Atlantic crossing. Washing water had been rationed. The ship was lighter than she should have been. None of this was enough to assign blame. All of it was enough to kill. The Admiralty tried to raise Eurydice. Divers and riggers worked through the spring and summer of 1878, sealing leaks, attaching chains, fighting the tides. On September 2nd, naval tugs Manly, Sampson, and Malta surrounded the wreck. Pumps were lowered onto the deck. At low water, pumping commenced, and by 10 o'clock that morning, she floated. What was left of her was towed to Portsmouth. She was never recommissioned. Her bell was hung in St. Paul's Church, Shanklin. Her figurehead, carved by J.E. Hellyer of Portsmouth Dockyard, was preserved, and eventually placed in the Figureheads Gallery at the National Museum of the Royal Navy. Her story entered the national consciousness as a wound that never fully closed, The poet Gerard Manley Hopkins wrote of her loss with raw anguish. Too proud, what a press she bore. Royal, and all her royals wore, sharp with her, shortened sail. Too late, lost, gone with the gale. The sinking of Eurydice did something no Admiralty order could have achieved. It ended the era of sail training in the Royal Navy. From that day forward, officers were no longer required to learn how to hand and reef sail. The age of wooden warships, of canvas and hemp, and the wind's mercy was over. And there is one final, devastating footnote. The ship that replaced Eurydice as the Royal Navy's seagoing training vessel was another 26-gun frigate of identical tonnage, HMS Juno, renamed HMS Atalanta. She made 2 successful voyages between England and the West Indies. On her 3rd crossing in 1880, she departed Bermuda bound for England. She was never seen again. All 281 souls aboard were lost. The sea had taken them, just as it had taken Eurydice, on the same route, from the same port, within 2 years. The chalk cliffs of Dunnos still rise above Sandown Bay. The waters there are shallow and cold. Local fishermen in Shanklin reported, in 1880, seeing a fully rigged sailing ship moving at speed across the bay, only for it to vanish as they approached. In 1934, Commander Lipscomb of the Royal Navy submarine HMS Proteus watched from his conning tower as a 3-masted man-of-war appeared from nowhere and nearly collided with his vessel before disappearing. In 1998, Prince Edward claimed to have seen the ship while filming on the Isle of Wight. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, one thing is certain. In those waters, just 8 miles from Portsmouth, just minutes from home, the sea holds more than 300 young men who never made it back. Their names are carved into stone at Shanklin. Their story is carved into the history of the Royal Navy, and the gun ports were open.